welcome to Book Salon at the Polis project, where we interview authors about their work. Today we have with us Kunal Purohit, who is a journalist from Mumbai. Thanks for coming on our show. And I wanted to chat with you about your book, which I enjoyed a lot, especially how I think it works on many different levels, as a work of anthropology, as literary journalism, investigative, and even I think analytically. I like how you draw parallels with what you see in different parts of the world. How did you manage this hybridity in your work?
I think some part of it came from the fact that I had not too long ago I had done my masters, and I think that just opened the world of academic literature to me. And it made me realize that I think as journalists, what we often do is we are constantly looking at the micro, right? And then we try and report and we try and chronicle that, but we often fail to make connections with what we call the macro, right? So we always think of events that happen as events happening in isolation,
Right.
Without a context, without a background, and without an afterlife. And I feel like I think as journalists, it's increasingly important for us to realize that there are so many things that are happening in conjunction with each other, and there is so much context that every piece of work that we put out requires us to bring in. So when I was doing this book, I firmly understood that what I'm seeing on the ground now, it might seem like something that is just starting off in say an Indian state, let's say Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh or Jharkhand, and it might seem like a local phenomena, but then when you keep zooming out is when you realize that there are so many layers that keep adding on to it, and in some ways the most zoomed out version of this is the fact that there are so many sort of transnational ties.
Right.
to the use of pop culture for propaganda purposes, especially in extremist and right-wing ideologies. So essentially, that was my job, to tell the reader that what you're seeing here is not in isolation, but it is almost a pattern that we're seeing replicated across the world in different contexts.
Yeah, I agree, and I did like the references you did make in each time, and we'll chat more about those too. But for now, I first wanted to ask about your three characters. Did you have other options whom you were juggling about who you wanted to tell the story through? Or did you always know that it's going to be these three early on itself?
Well, so when I first started looking, what I tried to do was just try and understand the landscape of each of these art forms. I had started off with music, and I was sure that I didn't want the book to only be about music, right? I felt like there was a broader, and as you said, just sort of zooming out a bit, and seeing whether this pattern of an art form like music being weaponized, was it something that was happening in other art forms as well, or was it a music specific story? And that's when I realized that there were other art forms, art forms like poetry and then literature. So when I started looking at all three, my first sort of thing that I did was just to look at all of these various artists who were performing these art forms in that context, in the Hindutva context. And I think something about these three made me, very peculiar things about each of them, made me sort of, go closer and examine them as potential subjects. And I think the more I understood, the more I was certain that I did want to stick to them. For the influencer part, there was someone else I was looking at. She's now actually a very, very popular influencer in the right wing. Her name is Kajal Hindustani. And she sort of goes around and delivers these very, very hateful speeches about Muslims, and she's like a rock star almost in that world. And then I tried to sort of have multiple conversations with her, and at some point she decided that she didn't want to do this, because she said that she had inputs from her security that hanging out with me was not such a great idea. So I respected that completely, and then that's when I started looking for an alternative, and that's when I stumbled upon Sandeep Deo. Because essentially what did happen was, with Sandeep Deo, I found someone who's straddling so many different worlds. He's not just an ex-journalist who's now on YouTube as a YouTuber. He's also an author himself, writing these books, and then he also goes on to establish his own publishing house, which is not just publishing these books, but also disseminating and circulating similar books being published by other publishing houses. And create an e-commerce website which will only and only sell products for Hindus and by Hindus, right? So there are just so many various strands to him that I found very exciting as a journalist, that I wanted to get closer and understand what he was all about. And of course the cherry on the cake is the fact that, you know, after following him for 4 years, in the last year of our interaction is when he finally sort of decides to break ranks with the BJP in some ways, and then decides that the BJP is actually too soft on Muslims.
Yeah.
And you know, it's almost sort of appeasing Muslims, and hence he wanted something which was far more, you know, sort of rabid and hardline when it comes to Hindutva, and which is why he then joins this far right party, which is called the Ekam Sanatan Dal. So that's essentially, you know, his journey, and that all of that made me look at him very, very closely and very fascinatingly as a journalist.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I mean, you know, spoiler alert on
Spoiler
all of
alert.
these things.
Absolutely.
But even speaking of spoilers, with, you know, Kavi Singh and even with Kamal Agney, like what I noticed a lot about them is this, you know, line between opportunism and ideological commitment. Like in Kamal's sections, how you explained how he would almost test his audience, you know, start slow on, you know, more broader nationalism, and then it would end up, you know, getting into more hateful space. So tell me more about these stories and how you fleshed out these characters, your decision, especially with Kavi Singh, about, you know, when to reveal the things that you reveal about her family, her husband, etc.
Look, Kashyap, I think one very integral part of this book that I was very clear about is that it will never be condescending towards them. It will never be, you know, sort of critical in the way that, you know, I'm never going to be indulging in name calling. I had decided that I'm not going to be sitting on a pedestal and being judgmental about what they were doing. The idea for me firmly was that, you know, these were all people who were extremely influential, extremely powerful as artists and as celebrities in some contexts as well. And I think in today's India, what we need is a better understanding of what drives people like them when they do what they do. So, you know, my sort of way to get to them was to try and, you know, humanize them, in the sense that, you know, a reader must never feel like these are distant, you know, sort of people who the reader has nothing in common with. In fact, the idea was to show how similar they are, right? I mean, people on either side of the political divide finally have so many similarities, right? You have very similar aspirations, you have very similar fears, you know, dreams for yourself and so on. So I think the commonality is something that we're constantly forgetting about. And I think on either side of the ideological divide, you see people, you perceive people on the other side to be, you know, almost demonic and so vastly different that there's nothing in common with them, is what the assumption always is. So it's in that context that I felt that I had to go deep into their personal lives. I also had decided that I wanted to actually understand where all of the hate was coming from.
Right.
And inevitably I figured that it was all having linkages to their own pasts. You know, sometimes to their childhoods, sometimes to things around them that they've seen as young adults and so on. So that was an interesting part for me, because I mean, you know, I believe that, especially in a context like India, I think it's increasingly important for us to understand some of the drivers of Hindutva and religious hate, and the way they're seeping in and the way they're finding more and more societal acceptability. So that process of radicalization that I call is extremely important for me to understand, and which is really why I chose to go so deep into their personal lives, because I felt like the readers must be on that journey when they start seeing how these people are so similar in so many ways, and yet there are certain things that happen in all of their lives which trigger a change of heart, right? Which trigger a political sort of, I mean, you're jumping across the political spectrum in some ways. So, for instance, Kamal Agney, you know, he's grown up around Muslims. He's grown up around having his father's best friend to be Muslim, and you know, he goes to their house, they come to his house. You know, they're sharing meals together. He's gone and voted for Akhilesh Yadav in his first ever election, right? So then what goes wrong for someone like him, and how does he then become the cheerleader of some of the most strident Hindutva rhetoric that I have heard. And then I think that transformation for me was very interesting, and then I think so should it be for people, just to be able to understand what it's taking for people to then make that switch politically. So honestly, that is the reason why I've gone into their lives so much. And I think just, in terms of when it unravels is really a narrative device, because I wanted people to also go on that journey with me. It was in many ways organic, right? It wasn't, I didn't start off knowing what I did about all of them at the beginning. I sort of, keep finding out in regular intervals what their lives are actually like. For instance, Kavi Singh, she meets me a bunch of times across 3-4 years. And then when she meets me in the 4th year, she reminds me of all the things that she's told me in the first couple of years. And I say, of course, I remember what you told me. Why are you asking me if I remember? And she says, yeah, that all of that was a lie, right? And this is now what I'm going to say is the truth. So they all had their own defense mechanisms, and they all had their walls up when they first encountered me. And over the course of 3-4 years is when those walls slowly started coming down. And I felt like the reader should also just get the exact same experience of that journey that I had, which is that when I first go in, I get a very different sense of their worlds, and then as I keep traveling along with them is when their worlds really unfold for me to see very clearly.
Yeah, and I think that worked really well for Kavi especially. I remember feeling so bad for her by the end of it, and like almost wishing that her videos did well again. And even on that exact note, I wanted to ask you ethically. Of course, it's a little questionable that these are people who have really harmful ideologies and participate in harmful ideological work. You yourself in the book liken especially Kavi Singh to Simon Bikindi, the Rwandan musician and singer who was charged. So I'm curious to know about what are the ethics of building these empathetic portraits of people, where, as I said, I started to feel that way, where actually their work is so violent and has, in fact, you started with how it incites violence. Yeah. What was that like?
Well, I think, Kashif, one thing that we often fail to see when we're analyzing, not just the right wing here, but also extremist movements everywhere, is the fact that I think we increasingly need to realize that we need to make a difference between, and we need to differentiate between, sort of the grassroots workers, the actual people who are doing all of this, who are possibly cheerleaders, and the people who are actually running the show at the top. I think there is a big difference between the culpability of both of these people, right? The people who are designing this, the people who are calling the shots, are people who I feel like must be held at the highest culpability possible. But I wouldn't say the same for people who often can be victims of, in their own senses of various circumstances and various propaganda. So the reason why I also get into their lives so deeply is to show that, right? Is to show that it's at very vulnerable moments in their lives that they start interacting and gain exposure to right-wing philosophy. And it's in those moments of vulnerability that they realize that the right-wing ideology starts creeping in. It starts sounding a lot relevant. It starts making sense, and it starts honestly providing an explanation for the world that they see unfolding before them. So I feel like that is an important distinction to make. I don't think empathy necessarily means that you let people off the hook.
Right.
I think empathy is just the tool in which you understand the actions of the people, and why they do the things that they do. It doesn't mean that that you give them a free pass. So I think empathy is extremely important for all of us. I think more so as a journalist, where I honestly do not feel that as journalists we must be sitting in judgment for profiling or chronicling everything that we see. I think our jobs as journalists, especially now more than ever before, is essentially to try and be as as objective, as problematic that term sometimes can be, but as objective in trying to at least tell the story accurately,
Right.
and to chronicle the actions and the worlds of people and things that we often don't understand, right? We may not be in agreement with a lot of things, and again, this is nothing new. In journalism school we were told this, that as journalists you would have to interact with someone who had committed a rape, you would have to interact with someone who was kidnapping children, you would have to interact with someone who was peddling drugs and possibly ruining the future of thousands. And yet the idea always was for you to get the story, right? It wasn't for you to go in there, march into their rooms and deliver a moral lecture on how they must be.
Yeah.
So I think that is just a learning that I have carried very dearly, and especially now in times like these when I think our ideologies are sometimes so transparent on our Twitter and our Instagram, that it almost feels like we'd never be able to actually show what true journalism is when it questions or challenges our political beliefs. So I think we need to step up to what is happening right now and be able to do this kind of journalism, as objectively and as dispassionately as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, of course, I don't think your book is objective at all. It definitely does take a position on this.
I feel like, Asham, it's not a position that I take by giving my opinion in sort of, in as many words. You will not find in the book anywhere me saying that Kavi is a terrible person or Kamal is, whatever, a communally charged man or whatever, right? I think what I tend to do here in the book, and this is again something conscious, is that I often try and fact check what they're saying. Right?
Yeah, you do that.
And I feel like that is important because that is where the journalism comes in. Do you give someone a free pass for the rhetoric, or do you actually fact check them and tell your reader that what someone is saying might sound ridiculously powerful, but actually it's factually inaccurate, or it's a complete lie, or it's misleading. I think that is where journalism has to come in. It's not in labeling people or sort of naming and giving them these various titles that journalism comes in. I think journalism is letting them speak for themselves and then maybe just contextualizing and putting the facts where they deserve to be.
On this idea of ideology as opposed to opportunism, we're not just dealing with politicians here, we're dealing with artists in a way. I mean, the poetry, music, journalism and writing, these are art forms that are, it's very difficult to make it in any context, especially in India here. And you deal with people who are wildly successful in these paths. So can you tell me more about what you think about the relationship between the proliferation of Hindutva in the political economy of virality, trends, and the way things are here? Like, what is the relationship?
Look, I think the Hindu right wing in India has been very successful in being able to infiltrate various platforms at a very early stage, right? At sort of a very nascent stage when the rest of us are just waking up to that platform. Right. They've been very, very early in trying to make very good inroads and trying to understand the various ways in which that particular platform can work for their benefit. And I think what you're seeing now, just in terms of the all-encompassing proliferation of Hindutva content, is a result of that determination, right? It's a result of the fact that they're very serious about trying to capture every mode that is possible of messaging and of information dissemination. So there is definitely that which is that they see that there is a space that opens up and they're very quick to take over that space. The other thing is that they're able to do this only because I think they're quick to also understand what works and what doesn't work. There's a lot of A/B messaging that also goes on, right? Where they're pushing various kinds of content and are able to actually tell what is traveling and what is not, what is working and what is not, and what is hitting virality and what is not getting viral. So they are constantly doing that, and I think that is one big reason why Hindutva content is now so widely available and widely popular as well. What that means is that over time, I think the creators who are also creating this content have not just gotten better and better, but there are also more and more people who see the scope of entering this domain, right? This space which has been made available to them, this Hindutva space, where they see that anything that gets into this space is often viral, right? Or is often shared by a number of people who are extremely influential. They can be, they can be ministers, they can be MLAs, they can be MPs, they can sometimes be members of the party. So they're seeing that there is that sort of traction that it's getting, and I think that is attracting a lot of people towards that space. So this sort of balance between opportunism and ideology is a very difficult and a very tricky one, because I don't think there are very clear-cut lines, right? You can be ideologically committed and driven, and yet you see the opportunity in being able to encash that. So there are some people like Kamal, for instance, who are ideologically extremely driven and extremely committed to Hindutva, but who also know that what they're doing is somewhat opportunistic, right? And which is why there is a moment in the book where he has that realization that he is being used, right, for greater gains by the political masters that he reports to. Or there is a moment when he's questioning why he's even doing this, when he's not actually reaping the benefits of, according to him,
as many of the benefits as he would have
liked. So there is always this contestation between opportunism and ideology, and I don't think it is as clear cut as one would like it to be, because I think often liberal analysts of right-wing politics look at episodes like these, or look at phenomena like these, and believe that all of it is driven by opportunism, all of it is driven by money, and I think that is grossly sort of mistaken very often. I think what you find in that space are lots of people who are very ideologically committed to the project, and who often believe that if their skills can be used to further, and if they're able to also gain fame, money, virality and access, then then it's really the best of both worlds. So I think I would just sort of warn against us jumping into any easy conclusions about this. This is a very, very interesting space where often things can go either way. There is sometimes more opportunism and less ideology, but then there are often times when there's a lot more ideology and very little opportunism. And, just to remind people who might have read the book, the case of Sandeep Deo, right? And I keep sort of thinking about the fact that here is a man who quit his full-time job to write a book about the Godhra riots, about the Godhra episode, the train burning, and about how that moment in time is really, according to him, is a conspiracy against Narendra Modi. And so he spends a better part of his prime doing that without a job. And then after the book is released, he then spends a few years just trying to get some sort of a media venture to work. He has various people who come to fund him, but according to him, all of them insist that he tone down his Hindutva rhetoric. And because of that condition, he just dismisses all of them, right? He kicks away the investment opportunities that he gets his way, and he waits till he finally meets or finally finds a way in which he can make Hindutva sustainable, in which he can make disseminating Hindutva and popularizing Hindutva to be his sustainable mission and a livelihood. So he spent many years in the wilderness, not having a lot of money, not having very lucrative resources at his disposal, and I think that is an example of the fact that there are people who are committed to the ideology so much that they will kick away opportunities as well, right? If they don't match the ideological requirements of the moment.
Yeah, but at the same time, for like Kavi Singh, she was arguably in a way groomed almost, and that she was initially not actually gaining traction in the content that she was making until she started making more hateful and provocative content and then doubled down on it. So I guess that's the opportunism.
Yeah, and look, I think this is also a moment of introspection for us as a society, because I think Kavi Singh's story demonstrates that to me, which is that she makes her name singing that first song that she sings about Pulwama, about the Pulwama terror attack, right? Where she essentially talks of how the people behind the terror attack, they're not Pakistanis, they're not terrorists, but they're essentially, Muslims who are living in India, right? People who must have who must have terrorist sympathies and so on. So she makes a song which is very very hardcore Hindutva, and then she actually goes on to make songs which are not at all as hardline Hindutva as
None
that.
of them do well.
Right, and these are all songs that sometimes are about motivating voters to go and vote for the elections that are coming up in 2019, the Lok Sabha elections. These are songs that hail India's history, its historical characters and so on. And as you said, none of them are able to match even a fraction of the popularity and the virality that Pulwama gets. So in some ways, if that is Kavi Singh's moment of realization, I almost think that is something that we need to look at and say, how did we get here? Where a song which is openly blaming Muslims and openly sort of insinuating that Muslims are terrorists or terrorist sympathizers at best, is a song that gains massive mad virality. But songs which are not political, not talking about Hindutva, not talking about Muslims, are nowhere close to that, right? So that is the moment where she realizes that if she has to really make a living, she has to then go back to doing stuff which is hardcore Hindutva. So I think it's as much about Kavi Singh and her opportunism, if that is, as much it is about all of us as society, right? And about the kind of content that we are now patronizing increasingly. So I think that's a glaring example of how this plays out on both sides.
Yeah, I see that. And what do you think is the role of institutional support then in maintaining this cultural hegemony? Like on the one hand, you see the BJP and other Hindutva organizations targeting groups like the Kabir, Kala Manch, and others, and then enabling these in this way. So how does that work, and are there any significant counterpoints on the left, or is that just not possible now?
Well, so I mean, you're absolutely right. Kashif, some of the songs that exist in the Hindutva pop sort of world and that are extremely popular as well are songs which give very violent and very direct threats to Muslims, right? They talk of how Muslims must be burned, they talk of how mosques must be demolished, they talk of how Muslims must be killed, how they must be thrown out of the country and so on. Now, despite these threats being so clear and so obvious and so out there, I don't recall any of these singers that I'm talking about ever facing any kind of police action, right? Not just from BJP ruled states, but also from states where so-called secular parties are governing. So I think that should tell you a lot about how the state is patronizing this kind of art form, not just in a very active way, but also in its in the impunity that it implicitly grants these artists, right? The sort of the free pass that these artists also get to dish out all kinds of rhetoric that they want to. As against that, I mean, you mentioned the Kabir Kala Manch. You look at the various sort of episodes that we see where people who have criticized the government, criticized Prime Minister Modi, criticized Yogi Adityanath, have all faced very serious charges, including sedition charges in the past. Right, so you see how selectively the government also operates when it comes to the criticism that is directed at itself, as against the hate that is directed at 200 million people in this country. So there is a very active role that the state has played in making H-pop popular and in also making H-pop the mainstay of the popular culture in the country today. Because let's not forget, I mean, not too long ago, maybe a month or so ago, in Maharashtra where we're sitting, in Mumbai where we're sitting, what we saw was the Maharashtra government being sworn in, which is a constitutionally mandated exercise of ministers and of the chief minister being sworn to protect the Constitution of India. But at the same time, that event featuring a singer of a Hindutva pop who's essentially dreaming of India being a Hindu Rashtra, right? Which is inimical to the Constitution of India, which calls India a secular nation, which ensures and which envisions that India will be a nation equal to all people of all religions. So we're seeing very actively the state making and playing its part in making Hindutva pop the mainstay of pop culture in India, and I think that should tell you, of just how the state not just patronizes it, but sometimes also gives it a free pass very, very actively.
Yeah, and I mean, this really freaks me out because you have, okay, as you said, you have leaders of the ruling party openly making hate speeches and driving hate rallies. You have school textbooks that are now increasingly peddling Hindutva history as a fact. You have, mainstream film industries only peddling Hindutva stories. WhatsApp and other social media inundated with Hindutva conspiracies, and now, as you said, pop music and poetry and these influencers and stuff too, all have been weaponized by the Hindutva ecosystem. So, with all of this together, I'm wondering, is there any way out of such a well-oiled machine? Are there actually ways of resisting this?
Well, so essentially, Kashif, and I think this was also in some ways linked to your previous question about the counter to something like this. The thing is, Kashif, I think it's a difficult, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but it is a pill that we must all, very humbly swallow, which is that Hindutva pop works because it finds great traction among people, right? The state can do what it wants to do in trying to popularize it, in trying to, sort of give, turn a blind eye to the kind of rhetoric these songs have, or this kind of content has. But at the end of the day, these songs have to resonate with wide number of people, right? There is a reason why these songs have millions and millions of listeners across the country. There is a reason why these songs are played in concerts, these songs are played in festivals, these songs are played, in cricket matches sometimes. These songs are played everywhere now. And that is not because, the RSS or the BJP or the Bajrang Dal or the VHP are backing these songs. It is because the people of the country are liking and wanting to consume these songs.
But it's like a chicken and egg situation of what came first, right?
I think I'm pretty clear where I stand on this, which is that, look, as I said, right, the state can patronize whatever it wants to. The state can try and push whatever it wants to. And I think a very good example of this is not music as much as cinema.
Right.
Because in the last few years, what we have seen is that the Indian government has very actively decided to patronize a certain kind of cinema. A cinema that ties in very closely with its Hindutva ideology. And yet not all of those films have worked, right? Not all of those films have been a blockbuster success. Some of them were, but some of them tanked very badly.
Yeah.
And that is because it somewhere did not resonate with people. So I think, as I said, I think I'm fairly certain that the state can do what it wants to. But if it doesn't resonate with people, if it doesn't hit the right chord, if people do not relate to that rhetoric, then that kind of content will not work. And that is also the case with Hindutva pop. I mean, the reason why it works is because there is now a vast societal acceptability for this kind of rhetoric. And there is a vast section of people in India who believe in and who agree with this kind of rhetoric. Hindutva pop is a product of its time and space, right? It's in this moment where we're sitting, where Hindutva is now the mainstay of Indian politics. It is the main political ideology around which Indian politics now sort of revolves, unfortunately, and which is why you will find more and more takers for this kind of rhetoric. So I think as long as people are consuming this, we need to find ways of being able to convince people that the Constitution of India envisions a very, very different India, right? That there are values, there are Gandhian values which have driven us to this point so far. That there is a different set of there is a very different moral compass that the country's forefathers had, right? That the people who created the Constitution had for a country like India, and that we're straying from that path. And I think it's important that we find more meaningful ways of making that message very clear. I think we're not able to speak to people in the language that they're best understanding, and I think the Hindutva right wing is extremely good at being able to do just that, at being able to break down its sometimes complex messaging into very easy, bite-sized, pieces of information, right? Which are enough for you to make an opinion. And I think people who do not agree with that ideology need to find more relevant ways in which they're able to reach more and more people. And I think that is where the failure is at this point.
Right. And speaking of, work on Hindutva politics in general, of course, there's a lot of conversation around Hindutva, and many works are out there that describe the trend, but very few, even analytically, can capture it in a powerful way. So I'm keen to hear from you about your inspirations in your book and works that you drew on. Like, which ones would you say were the most inspirational to you in their exploration of Hindutva in India, or in broader context of the role of music and pop culture in majoritarian violence?
Well, so, to be honest, I mean, I do not mean to sound boastful at all, but when I first started researching, this issue, I didn't find a lot of literature out there which would make me understand, what was really happening. So I think in that sense, for me to find inspiration was difficult because I didn't have too much to begin with, right, in terms of references and so on. I mean, we had various sort of disparate pieces of journalism that had, as I said, sort of tried to capture very, very micro, events around this. But there was nothing which was substantial enough for me to be able to look at and say, okay, if this is what is happening, then this is the kind of book I want to write. Having said that, I think there's wonderful journalism and wonderful scholarship that exists in the world, which will inspire journalists like me, and which has inspired people like me to be able to, as I said, sort of keep your own political leanings aside. And be as dispassionate in being able to chronicle something that a substantial section of the population is only very happy to label and dismiss. So there is a book called Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo. It's a great work of narrative nonfiction that I have personally enjoyed immensely. It is something that I have sort of personally sought inspiration from, just in terms of being able to tell people's stories in a way that is extremely relatable to the audience, to the reader. There's a great work of non-fiction that I'm currently enjoying, which is called No Good Men Among the Living by an author called Anand Gopal. And again, that book is a book of reportage from war-torn Afghanistan, in the time when the Americans sort of invade Afghanistan, and then the Hamid Karzai government comes into place. And it actually goes deep into the country and follows the lives of very disparate people, like a former Taliban commander, and sees things from people like his character's point of view. So I think there are these sort of work of non-fiction, work of reportage, which I believe more and more journalists must engage with, to be able to go beyond these assumptions that we often fall into the trap of.
Yeah, makes sense. Speaking of potential criticism as well of your work, I think in this context, that I was wondering at least about the caste identities of your interlocutors. That how would you respond to critiques that your book, as an elite caste writer's work, is a little bit condescending towards such a mass pop music?
Well, so unfortunately, what did happen, Kashif, through the process of reporting, is that all three of them, in fact, I mean, this is something that in itself tells you a story. All three of them refused to reveal their caste to me. Right, despite me at numerous points through the 4 years trying to have a conversation with them about their castes, and the rhetoric was strikingly similar to the rhetoric that the RSS, for instance, has had on caste, which is that they all three of them said that our caste doesn't matter because we do not believe in caste, right? We don't have a caste identity because we believe that we are Hindus and only So they told me how they make it a point, and which is also true. They make it a point in their work to tell people that they do not believe in castes, and nor should their audience, because again this ties into a very very old sort of effort by the RSS to try and invisibilize in some ways caste identities, at least ostensibly, and mobilize people under that uniform Hindu identity against against the singular enemy, which is the Muslim. So the idea always has been to try and mobilize everyone and make them forget that they are they have been subjugated along caste lines for all of these decades and centuries, and for them to just believe that they are Hindus and Hindus alone, and there is an existential threat that exists right before their eyes. So in some ways, their attempt was to do exactly that with me. And the process of this book was also such that we had to get there, in order to be able to get the kind of access that we did, in order to be able to publish the kind of stuff that we did, we had to get their sanction, we had to get their approval, we had to get their consent on in terms of the legality. And one of the things that we did have to sort of in there agree with is that they had to agree with everything that we were writing, or at least they would have to then confirm that they had spoken to me about all of these things, and that they were happy to talk about these things and let it be published. And caste was something that they had all expressly refused to tell me about, and told me that I should not be writing about their caste identities. So I believe, I believe that is a failing of the book, in the sense that I wish that there was more that I could have done in terms of exploring their caste backgrounds, and exploring their own sense of what their caste is, and how that could have tied into the Hindutva project. But as I said, sometimes there are these sort of minor quibbles that one has, and minor compromises one has to make in order to tell a much more important and a much broader story about the Hindutva project at this point.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And what I wanted to know from you at the end was, where do you see yourself continuing this project in the future? You think you're done with the H-pop? Do you think you want to move on to different topics?
Well, not quite. So in fact, I'm at this point as well, trying to do a broader report, which might possibly come in a couple of months, which is again looking at Hindutva pop and how it is being patronized by various platforms, right? By big tech and by various social media platforms, and how so many of these artists get a very lucrative source of patronage from these platforms as well. So it's then not just the state, it's not just the political wings, but it's also various platforms contributing in some ways to the overall climate of hate. And I'm trying to see if we can establish that suspicion that I harbor. So I feel like I will be continuing my work in this space, because I think what is now happening is that the use of pop culture for propaganda is only getting deeper and better, right? In being more covert, in being more deceptive, and in being way more potent than sometimes direct political rhetoric can be. So I feel like I will be continuing in this journey and trying to explore as much of it as I can, because at the end of the day, I'm a journalist. I'm not a career author, which is that I just don't write books for a living.
Right.
I am someone who enjoys being on the ground. I am someone who wants to chronicle what is happening in today's India. And I feel that the use of pop culture for right-wing propaganda is an extremely important story to be told, to understand how Hindutva is gaining more and more societal acceptability.
You mentioned streaming platforms, or you mentioned social media, like big tech. What's your view on regulation, the question of free speech as opposed to regulating hate speech? What do you think should be the role of big tech in all this? Especially now that Meta and other places are ending their fact-checking programs.
Right.
What should?
Yeah, I mean, look, it is a tricky debate, right? Because there is, we are journalists, right? We thrive on the freedom of expression, and then so many of these artists, when I would question them about exactly this, would go back and quote the freedom of expression as the thing that they rely on when they want to send their rhetoric out. And my thing is, I think the line must be at very direct calls of violence, right? And at very direct attempts at stoking hate which targets one community specifically. These are then no longer opinions that you are putting out. These are very, very direct threats to a community's safety, to their sense of harmony. And I think that what we're seeing in India is exactly that, which is that one community, the Muslim community, has been made the target of so much of this rhetoric, where it happens at multiple levels, right? It happens at the level of not just giving out threats of violence, but there's a stage which precedes the violence, which I have seen in my reportage around hate crimes, is the stage of normalization of hate, right? It is the stage where people consume the hate, where people consume the kind of the kind of dehumanization that is floating around, targeting Muslims, and where people accept that Muslims are a target of dehumanization, right? And that for me is the genesis of violence and of even genocides in so many different cases. So I think we need to understand that this normalization is also extremely critical to tackle, and it's not just the fact that if there is rhetoric which calls for direct violence, that only that should be tackled. So I feel like there is a need to look at it way more holistically. There is a need to look at the various stages of hate, and there is a need to study past precedents better. So for instance, in my book as well, you mentioned Simon Bikindi, and this is something that I have quoted as well, right? As a very deliberate example of the fact that at a given moment hate has been very, very successfully weaponized, for it to then in the future create way for hatred and create way for direct violence. So I think this is very critical for us to understand, and I mean, I wish that there is more attention paid to regional contexts in a country like India, which is something that almost every social media platform very deliberately refuses to do, because hate is popular, hate gets more eyeballs, hate is also what keeps them in the good books of the government, because the government is very, very directly sometimes linked to so many of these hateful rhetoric and hateful content. But I feel like this is now time that platforms step up. The platforms see what is happening in a country like India and countries across the world, and then they crack the whip, and to the very least do not make hate a lucrative and a sustainable mode of content making, right? That is in essence the least that one should be expecting from them.
Yeah. Well, that's a very grim note to end on. So I would like to ask, given your desire to continue this work, does it not get really depressing to spend so much of time with people who harbor so much hate? Where do you find hope in all of this?
I think as a journalist, an integral part of your existence as a journalist is that there is a place in your heart where hope constantly thrives, right? That there is constant hope for a better future, for a brighter future, for a future which is more harmonious and less divided and less polarized. Because the way I look at it, Kashif, is that if there was no hope, then I think journalism loses some of its punch.
You wouldn't be doing this.
You wouldn't be doing this. You wouldn't be as driven to chronicle everything if you believe that this is something that only future generations are going to refer to. You do this because you believe that this will help people understand their world better and maybe reform themselves, maybe reform their surroundings, maybe change things for the better. So I mean, it is difficult. It is a tall order sometimes, but I like to believe that I am hopeful that we will overcome, because if there is anything that history tells you, be it the history of a country like India, be it the history of the world, it is that the world overcomes some of its most grimmest, some of its darkest moments through sometimes collective will, through sometimes the will and the leadership of people, and I feel like we will also see a phase like that in India.
Thank you, Kunal. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you so much, Kashif. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you for all the work that you and the project does. It only enriches all of our lives. Thank you.
For more videos like this, follow the Polis project.